You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with some information from K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Shelby.
Roger, today wanting to talk about one of your recent blog articles, and one of the things within that article talks about the Clean Water Act. And so as we start off today's conversation, what is the Clean Water Act?
Well, the Clean Water Act has been around for a little bit more than a half a century. The major amendments were back in 1972. And for the point of our discussion today, which is very important to farmers, is that there is a permit discharge requirement before you can discharge a pollutant into the navigable waters of the United States. Now, the term pollutant is defined very broadly, and that can include sediment. It can include lots of things that we wouldn't necessarily think are pollutants. And so if that discharge permit requirement applies, which you have to have if you're discharging a pollutant from a point source into a navigable water, then that's very costly. It's time-consuming for farmers and ranchers. And so that's the main point of what we're going to get into today.
Thinking of these different farmers and ranchers and wanting to specifically look at a cranberry farming operation and how they're dealing with the Clean Water Act.
Yeah, there's a case that's been filed in late February this year, so it's a brand new case in Federal District Court, Western District of Wisconsin, against the cranberry operation. And in that case, they're arguing that an exemption that normally applies to agriculture should not apply in this instance. And what that exemption is known as the Irrigation Return Flow Exemption. So in other words, if I irrigate my farm fields and there are chemicals on my fields and through the process it gets into underground water and then might find its way into surface water, I don't have to have a permit for that because that's part of irrigation agriculture and that's exempted. That's not a direct discharge of a pollutant into a navigable water. It's by means of a process that it got there. And so by means of that irrigation process, it's exempted. Well, the claim in this case is that cranberry farming operations should not be able to use that exemption because they're not irrigating. And so by the strict construction of that term, it should not apply. But what happens here, and what the claim is that a channel and a ditch, which were next to this cranberry bog. Cranberries are raised in bogs and then drained. But because of a ditch and a channel that are nearby, the ditch and the channel serve as a point source discharge of phosphorus and sediment discharges into a nearby lake when the bogs are drained at harvest time for the cranberries. And phosphorus and sediment are pollutants under the Clean Water Act. And the claim is, well, that water is in the bogs is not used for irrigation. It's to aid in the overall growing process and protect the cranberries from freezing and harvesting. And so the irrigation return flow exemption should not apply.
And why is this something, while Kansas might not have cranberry operations, is still really important to the state?
Well, it's a big deal because depending on what the courts say in terms of the breadth of that exemption by definition applies to crop agriculture. So this is one, if you get a court here that broadly construes the application of this exemption and then wipes it out, then we become very concerned about that in terms of crop irrigation agriculture because then we'd lose the exemption. Now, I don't think that will happen because the exemption is statutory. And we're dealing with a construction of the statutory exemption by the agency here. So I don't think the court would strike it out of the statute. They have no authority to do that. But we worry about the possible breadth of any change to the irrigation return flow exemption. So not just cranberries, but rice production also would think would be right at this because rice is grown very similarly in many respects to the way cranberries are grown. But this is one to keep on the radar, and we'll keep people informed as to where this is going. It just got filed in late February, so we're at the trial court stage on this. We haven't had a trial yet. It's set for trial, and then we'll have some time before the trial court decides it, and then I'm sure it'll be appealed. And so we've got a process to go through here, but it's an interesting one to watch.
And another case being watched and important to talk about, PFAs. And as we talk about PFAs, what are they? Well,
PFAs are really a widely used and long-lasting chemical that have components that break down slowly over time. They've been around since the 1940s, so it's nothing new. And they're found in water and air and soil all over the place, U.S. and other countries across the globe. And they're contained in many commercial and industrial products. The carpet in this studio that we're recording in right now probably has PFAs in it. And some studies have shown that PFAS may be linked to harmful health effects in humans and animals and cause various cancers and other health problems. And currently there's no known method for cleaning up PFAS contamination. Now, the biggest potential problem for agriculture will likely be biosolids, because biosolids have become a pretty cost-effective substitute for other types of fertilizer. Fertilizer prices have gone up significantly in recent years, and so biosolid use has actually increased as a result of this. And biosolids are the solid matter that remains at the end of a wastewater treatment process, and they're often land-applied. And farmers find benefits in land applying those, and they recycle nutrients and fertilizers and are cost-effective, as I mentioned.
And as farmers are finding benefits, there are also a few concerns that come with using biosolids.
Well, if the biosolids get contaminated with PFAS, those PFAS don't break down. And now you've got them on your soil. You've incorporated them into your crop rotation. The plants uptake that, and it's going to be there for quite some time. It could be you could harvest crops on land that you land applied the biosolids as fertilizer. Then you grow the crops, you feed them to your livestock. Then your livestock get contaminated. And if testing is done and it shows up, you can be shut down. And that's a really big concern for agriculture.
And there's a case that's an example of that.
Yeah, indeed. In 2022, there was a Michigan 400-acre cattle farm that was a century farm, so it's been in this family for over a century, and they were forced to shut down due to the presence of high levels of PFAS in their beef products from that operation and in the soil at their farm. Now, Michigan is one state that is aggressive in testing for the presence of PFAS, and that farm had received biosolids from a municipal wastewater treatment plant to fertilize their crops, and the farmer later harvested those crops and fed them to his cattle and created the problem. He can't sell the cattle. He can't sell the crops he would harvest from the farm. He's basically being bankrupted in place. And so he's claiming that, of course, he didn't know that the biosolids were contaminated. Testing wasn't done at the wastewater treatment plant. It was done after the fact. And so he had no knowledge of it. The wastewater treatment plant didn't have any knowledge of the contamination. And what they've done is trace it back to an auto parts supplier that released chromium into the wastewater system that allegedly contaminated the biosolids. And so he's seeking millions of dollars in punitive damages to help cover the cost of remediating his farm soil and groundwater. So again, he's stuck until the court, if the court were to decide in his favor, he's got major problems. And Kansas currently does not test for PFAS in wastewater, but that's not to say that they might not do that in the future.
And you've mentioned Michigan and where Kansas currently stands on this. And there's a recent case from early 2024 that involves Texas farmers.
Right. In late February, there's a group of Texas farmers that have had the same problem of contamination by PFAS in biosolids that they used on their farms. And the allegation against this company, this is a major manufacturer. They're a major biosolid provider for manufacturing, I should say. And the claim was they distributed contaminated biosolid-based fertilizer that was applied to these farms in Texas. And the claim is in this that the company either knew or should have known that it was putting a defective product in commerce, the contaminated biosolids. And you've got product defect claims and negligence claims and private nuisance claims. And so that's another one we're going to have to watch. That just more recently got filed in late February. So again, we'd have to go to the trial court, then we'd have obviously an appeal. So we're ways down the road on a resolution of this. But this PFA contamination or PFAS contamination issue is becoming a big deal for farmers and ranchers.
As we are talking about these different farmers and ranchers, wanting to mention that states do have different ways of dealing with PFAS.
Right. There are just a handful of states, and I mean literally one handful of states, 4 or 5 states that do aggressive testing for these. Kansas, is, as I said, is not one of those states, and Maine has taken pretty aggressive legislative action. They've actually banned the land application of biosolids and have set up a fund for impacted farmers. Other states are looking into providing compensation for disaffected farmers. So this is something that we're going to continue to watch in subsequent different legislative sessions across the country next year. I don't think we'll see any more action this year. We're kind of late in most sessions for this year. But this is an issue that's going to be in the courts as well as in various state legislatures for the foreseeable future.
If people would like to read more on this topic and keep up to date as things come out, how can they do that?
You can access my blog off the homepage of my website, which is washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, also on the Ag Manager site here at K-State Ag Econ Department.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us some information about agricultural law.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. His blog article that talks about this is titled Property Rights Edition, Irrigation Return Flows, PFAS, and the Quiet Title Act. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it on washburnlaw.edu/WALTR or on agmanager.info.